The mountains of Appalachia have a way of swallowing sound. By the time the sun slips behind the ridgeline, even footsteps feel like trespass. In 1886, one such hollow existed beyond maps and memory, where smoke rose daily from a single cabin and no one asked why the same man's name appeared on every record that ever left the valley. The sisters were born into silence. Raised among trees older than any law, they learned early that the outside world was something seen only from a distance. Their father, a widower with a stern voice and a preacher's certainty, decided what was right, what was sacred, and what was never to be questioned. In that place, authority did not wear a badge, it wore blood. Winter closed in, and with it, the final separation. No neighbors visited. No children left. When official papers were finally signed, they were stamped far away, by clerks who never saw the cabin or the eyes that watched from its doorway. On paper, nothing looked wrong. In reality, something irreversible had begun. Years passed. Children were born who should not have existed, carrying traits that unsettled even those who didn't understand why. The family line folded in on itself, generation after generation, creating a clan shaped not by chance, but by control and isolation. The mountains held the secret tightly, burying it beneath trees, time, and fear. And for more than a century, America forgot, or never knew, what had taken root in those woods. Until the quiet finally broke, and the past spoke back. The forgotten Appalachian Hollow existed in a place where geography itself enforced secrecy, a narrow valley thick with hardwood forest, steep ridges, and winding paths that discouraged outsiders long before any human choice did. These hollows were not merely remote, they were isolating by design, shaped by mountains that blocked sound, slowed travel, and erased visibility. In the late 19th century, entire families could live only a few miles from a town and still remain functionally invisible to the wider world. This hollow was one such place, absent from reliable maps and spoken of only in passing by those who lived nearby, usually with a lowered voice. It was the kind of place where weather decided when you ate, when you traveled, and when you were cut off entirely. Roads washed out. Trails disappeared under leaves. Seasons came hard and left harder. Life in such isolation produced its own rules. With no constant law presence, no schools, and no regular church oversight, authority became personal rather than institutional. The hollow was governed not by written codes but by whoever controlled land, food, and protection. Outsiders rarely stayed long, sensing an unspoken boundary that made hospitality feel conditional. Even census workers and traders learned to move quickly, record little, and ask fewer questions. Silence became the price of access, and most were willing to pay it. The hollow's isolation also erased accountability. Births, deaths, and marriages were often recorded late or not at all, especially when travel to county offices required days of effort. What did get filed was frequently based on word alone, unverified and unquestioned. Over time, this meant reality and record drifted apart, allowing lives to unfold unobserved by anyone with the power or interest to intervene. The mountains did not just hide people, they protected patterns by keeping them unseen. Psychologically, such places reshaped perception. When the same faces form the entirety of one's world, behavior becomes normalized simply through repetition. The absence of external reference points made the hollow a closed system, where traditions, beliefs, and authority reinforced themselves generation by generation. Children grew up understanding that the world stopped at the tree line and that survival depended on obedience to whoever stood at the center of the hollow's power structure. This environment did not create darkness on its own, but it allowed it to grow unchecked. Secrecy was not unusual here, it was necessary. Privacy blurred into concealment, and concealment slowly hardened into silence. By the time anyone outside sensed that something was wrong, the hollow had already learned how to disappear into itself, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and the uneasy feeling that the mountains had chosen not to speak about what they had seen. The strange marriage records appeared quietly, buried among routine filings in a distant county office far from the mountains themselves. In the 1880s, record-keeping in rural America was inconsistent at best, and in places like Appalachia it depended almost entirely on trust. Clerks recorded what they were told, rarely questioning the stories of those who traveled long, difficult roads to stand before a desk and sign their names. Many records were written days or even months after the events they described, copied from memory, altered by accents, or simplified to fit expectations. In that system, paperwork did not reflect truth so much as it reflected convenience. These particular marriage entries did not raise alarms at first glance. Names repeated, but repetition was common in small communities. Ages were vague, sometimes estimated, sometimes intentionally obscured. Relationships were not verified, only declared. If two people claimed the right to marry and no one present objected, the record was stamped and filed. The clerk never saw the hollow, never met the extended family, and never witnessed the dynamics that made those vows deeply unnatural. The paper trail looked ordinary because it had been stripped of context. What made the records unsettling was their pattern. Over time, researchers would notice that the same surname dominated multiple roles: groom, father, witness. The spacing between marriages and births was unusually tight, as if generations were overlapping rather than progressing. Some documents contradicted earlier ones, correcting ages downward or changing parental names entirely. These were not obvious errors, they were subtle distortions, the kind that required comparison across years to reveal anything strange. Distance played its part. The county office was far enough away that no official ever returned with questions. Once a record was filed, it became fact, protected by the assumption that someone else had already verified it. That assumption created a blind spot where impossible relationships could exist on paper without scrutiny. Silence flowed both ways. The mountains did not ask questions of the outside world, and the outside world did not look back toward the mountains. These documents also carried a kind of institutional innocence. They lacked emotion, stripped events of their human weight, and reduced lives to ink and dates. A marriage became an entry rather than a moment, a legal acknowledgement rather than a moral inquiry. In doing so, the system unintentionally shielded what it recorded. What could not be imagined was not investigated, and what was not investigated was allowed to endure inside folders that no one opened again for decades. By the time those records were re-examined, the truth they hinted at had already completed its work, preserved not because anyone approved of it, but because no one had ever truly seen it. The disappearance of the two mountain sisters from public life was not sudden enough to cause alarm, which is precisely why it succeeded. In isolated Appalachian communities during the late 19th century, withdrawal was common and rarely questioned. Families moved deeper into the woods, stopped attending church, or ceased trading simply because travel became harder or trust wore thin. When the sisters were last seen during a winter census visit, they were recorded as present, quiet, and unmarried, standing just behind their father as he answered questions on their behalf. After that season, no one outside the hollow reported seeing them again in any public space. Their absence blended seamlessly into the rhythms of rural life. Census records were years apart. Church rolls were informal. Markets operated on memory rather than documentation. Women in particular could vanish from public view without triggering concern, especially if a male head of household claimed they were ill, married elsewhere, or no longer living under his roof. In this case, the explanation changed with the listener, but the result was the same: no follow-up, no visit, no insistence on verification. What made their disappearance especially effective was the role of winter. Snow closed paths, rain erased tracks, and the hollow became unreachable for months at a time. By the time spring reopened the landscape, the expectation of seeing the sisters again had faded into assumption. People remembered their faces vaguely, then not at all, until they existed only as names that felt increasingly abstract. When children later appeared in the area with familiar features, no one connected them to the women who had once stood quietly near the edge of conversation. Inside the hollow, disappearance did not mean absence. It meant containment. The sisters' lives narrowed until the world was reduced to cabin walls, tree leans, and the authority that governed both. With no external witnesses and no internal dissent, their identities shifted from daughters to something unnamed and unacknowledged. They were no longer part of the community's memory, only part of its consequences. The lack of alarm also reflected a broader social blindness. Rural America in that era was full of untracked lives, especially those of women whose stories were considered domestic rather than historical. Disappearance was often treated as relocation or compliance, not a warning sign. This allowed severe situations to persist without interruption, wrapped in the assumption that what could not be seen was no longer happening. By the time outsiders noticed irregularities in birth patterns and overlapping ages, the sisters were already erased from public awareness, transformed into ghosts whose absence had been normalized so completely that no one could remember when they had last been free. The widowed patriarch's role as the singular authority in the hollow was both a product and a perpetuator of isolation. In the absence of external governance, authority naturally fell to whoever could maintain control over resources and tradition. This man, having lost his spouse early, assumed the mantle of power without challenge. With no local law enforcement and no neighbors to question his decisions, his word became the de facto law. The cabin, deep within the mountains, was not merely a home, it was a fortress where his authority went unopposed and unexamined. In such a setting, power was not just about enforcing rules, it was about defining reality. The patriarch's decisions shaped the lives of his children and any others who came under his influence. With no legal or social checks, his commands and beliefs went unchallenged, and the boundaries of what was permissible were drawn solely by his judgment. The isolation of the hollow meant that any dissent or inquiry was quickly silenced by the difficulty of reaching the outside world. In this way, his authority became absolute, an unbroken chain of command that extended from the oldest traditions to the youngest generations. This unchallenged power also meant that the patriarch could impose a worldview that was both rigid and insular. He decided who spoke, who stayed, and who left, and his interpretation of family and duty became the only lens through which life was understood. In a place where travel was arduous and communication infrequent, the patriarch's voice was the only one that carried weight. This environment allowed him to mold the family structure to his will, creating a dynamic where obedience was not just expected but necessary for survival. As time passed, the patriarch's authority solidified, becoming the foundation of the family's existence. The sisters, and others in the hollow, grew up under his direct influence, their lives shaped by the rules he set forth. The absence of any external oversight meant that behaviors and relationships that might have been questioned elsewhere were instead normalized within the hollow's confines. The patriarch's decisions were not subject to outside scrutiny, and so, the family's patterns of behavior, however troubling, were preserved and perpetuated. This concentration of power also created an environment where isolation and control became self-sustaining. The patriarch's authority was reinforced by the very geography that kept the hollow secluded. Without any external intervention, his influence extended into every aspect of daily life, from marriage and family to social norms and personal freedoms. The mountains, in their silent watch, ensured that the patriarch's rule remained unchallenged, making the hollow a place where reality was defined by one man's will. In this unbroken chain of authority, the patriarch's role was not just a matter of leadership but of survival. His decisions, though often harsh and isolating, were the means by which the family navigated a world that was both physically and socially cut off from the rest of society. And in that isolation, his power became the unchallenged cornerstone of the hollow's existence. In the isolated confines of the hollow, the birth of children became a pattern that was both frequent and unnervingly rapid. Neighbors, who seldom ventured close enough to question, began to notice that the intervals between births seemed unusually short, as if the cycle of life itself had accelerated. This repetition was not just a matter of timing, it was a subtle indication of a deeper, more troubling reality. The community, already distant and fragmented, had no means to connect these dots, and the hollow's remoteness allowed such patterns to remain unchallenged and unexamined. As the years passed, the frequency of births seemed to defy natural rhythm. Where once a reasonable span of time separated generations, now children appeared almost in quick succession. This was not merely a matter of poor record-keeping or simple coincidence, it was a reflection of a family structure that had been tightly closed off from the influences of the outside world. In a place where isolation was the norm, the absence of external genetic diversity led to a repetition of traits, and the community's genetic pool became increasingly insular. These frequent births, when viewed from the outside, would have raised questions about health, relationships, and the underlying causes. However, within the hollow, the patriarch's authority and the family's insularity meant that such observations never reached the outside world. The children's presence, though numerous, was treated as normal, a natural outcome of the family's existence rather than a cause for concern. This normalization was reinforced by the lack of outside interaction, making what would be alarming elsewhere simply another aspect of daily life in the hollow. The patterns of birth also reflected the social dynamics within the family. The patriarch's control over relationships and the absence of external influence meant that the family's lineage intertwined and reinforced itself. Each new child carried forward the genetic legacy of the hollow, and the rapid succession of births was a manifestation of this closed system. Over time, the frequency of births became a silent testament to the family's isolation, a cycle that was both self-perpetuating and self-contained. In addition, the community's distance ensured that any anomalies or irregularities in the family's reproductive patterns went unnoticed. The hollow's residents, focused on survival and the rhythms of nature, paid little attention to the broader implications of these frequent births. The patriarch's influence, coupled with the family's secluded lifestyle, created an environment where the normalization of such patterns was inevitable. This normalization, in turn, perpetuated the cycle, making it harder for anyone outside the hollow to detect the underlying issues. Ultimately, the frequent births served as a quiet indicator of the hollow's unique and troubling reality. They were a reflection of a family that had become its own world, isolated from the natural checks and balances that would have otherwise moderated such patterns. The repetition of these births was not just a matter of numbers, it was a silent echo of a larger, more complex story of isolation, control, and the hidden consequences of a closed-off existence. The arrival of a traveling preacher into the isolated hollow brought with it a whisper of the outside world, a fleeting glimpse of a moral authority that extended beyond the mountains. In the 1880s, itinerant ministers often journeyed into remote areas, hoping to spread religious teachings and offer solace. However, the preacher's visit to the hollow was marked by an uneasy sense of disquiet. He sensed something deeply amiss, not just in the physical isolation, but in the unspoken undercurrents of the family's life. His presence was brief, a fleeting encounter that left more questions than answers. As he entered the hollow, the preacher found himself struck by the starkness of the landscape and the stern demeanor of the patriarch. The family's isolation was palpable, not just in the physical barriers of dense forests and rugged terrain, but in the way the household operated, detached from common customs and norms. The preacher observed the sisters and their father with a keen eye, noting the subtle, unsettling details that hinted at a deeper, hidden reality. The sisters' quiet compliance and the father's authoritative control were red flags that sparked his concern. In his short stay, the preacher tried to offer comfort and guidance, but he quickly realized that his role was limited. The patriarch's authoritative presence overshadowed any attempts at open discussion or intervention. Every conversation the preacher had was carefully navigated, with the father's responses cloaked in a veneer of normalcy that masked the underlying tension. The preacher, seasoned in reading the subtle signs of distress and moral discord, felt the weight of something unspoken, a darkness that lay beneath the surface. Despite his unease, the preacher had to leave, bound by the schedule of his travels and the demands of other communities. His departure marked a return to silence for the hollow, as the family resumed their isolated existence. The preacher's brief visit, however, left an indelible mark on his memory. He carried with him the lingering sense of something profoundly wrong, a suspicion that the family's isolation was more than just physical, it was moral and emotional as well. This fleeting encounter highlighted the profound gap between the hollow and the outside world. The preacher, with his outsider perspective, could see the cracks in the family's facade, but he was powerless to bridge that gap. His visit was a reminder of how isolation can distort reality, creating a world where normalcy is defined by those who hold power rather than by shared community standards. In the end, the preacher's departure restored the hollow to its state of obscurity, leaving behind only the echo of his concern and a deeper mystery that would remain hidden until the outside world dared to look closer. In this way, the preacher's visit was both a moment of revelation and a testament to the strength of the family's isolation. It was a brief, poignant encounter that underscored the difficulty of penetrating such deep-seated secrecy, leaving the hollow to continue its existence, unchanged and unseen. In the remote depths of the hollow, the family's isolation gradually evolved into a deliberate separation from the outside world. The patriarch, aware of the increasing scrutiny that might arise if outsiders ventured too close, took measures to ensure that the hollow remained impenetrable. Trails that once led to neighboring areas were gradually obscured, overgrown with thick underbrush and tangled vines. Paths that connected the hollow to the broader community became increasingly treacherous, intentionally designed to deter any who might attempt to visit. This deliberate severance of connections was not merely about physical distance, it was a conscious effort to create a barrier of isolation that protected the family's way of life from prying eyes. As time passed, this isolation transformed into a fortress of silence. The family's movements became confined within the hollow, and any interaction with the outside world was not just rare but almost non-existent. The patriarch enforced a strict policy of self-reliance, ensuring that all necessary resources, from food to tools, were sourced internally. This self-sufficiency was both a survival strategy and a means of reinforcing the family's insularity. It also meant that the family grew increasingly distrustful of outsiders, viewing any attempt at contact as a potential threat to their secluded existence. The intentional isolation extended beyond physical barriers. Social interactions were minimized, and any form of communication with the outside world was carefully controlled. When occasional visitors or traders did reach the hollow, they found themselves met with a guarded, wary reception. The family's reluctance to engage with outsiders was a protective measure, one that preserved the secrets and patterns that had developed over generations. This guardedness ensured that the family's internal dynamics remained undisturbed, allowing the patriarch to maintain his authority without external interference. Over the years, the family's isolation became a self-perpetuating cycle. The more they withdrew, the more their lives were shaped by the immediate environment, and the more their traditions and behaviors diverged from the norms of the outside world. The hollow's isolation was not just a physical state but a psychological one, where the family's worldview was molded by their limited interactions and the patriarch's control. This created a unique culture within the hollow, one that was both a refuge and a prison. As the hollow's trails disappeared and the family's connections with the outside world faded, the once clear boundaries between the family and the broader society became blurred. The isolation solidified into an identity, and the patriarch's authority became the defining force of the hollow's existence. In this way, the family's deliberate separation from the outside world ensured that their unique patterns and secrets remained hidden, protected by the very geography that surrounded them. This intentional severance of ties was both a shield and a shackle, safeguarding their way of life while also trapping them in a cycle of isolation that would persist for generations. Death certificates from the hollow, when they eventually emerged, told a story that was both repetitive and eerie. Each document, carefully recorded by distant officials, listed names that had become eerily familiar over the years. As death visited the hollow, it did so with a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. Familiar names reappeared again and again, as if the same family line was perpetually cycling through life and death. This repetition was not merely a coincidence, it was a reflection of the hollow's insular nature and the consequences of its isolation. In the broader context of rural America, death certificates served as a record of life's end, a way for society to acknowledge and document the passing of individuals. However, in the hollow, these records often revealed more than just a loss, they exposed a troubling continuity. The same names appearing on multiple death certificates hinted at a cycle that was both inevitable and unnatural. It was as if the family's lineage, constrained by isolation, repeated itself in a pattern that defied the natural progression of generations. What made these death certificates so unsettling was the absence of external verification. The officials who recorded these deaths were far removed from the hollow, and their understanding of the family's dynamics was limited to what was reported. As a result, the documents became a reflection of the hollow's reality, one that was shaped by isolation and the patriarch's authority. The repetition of names on these certificates suggested a closed loop, where the same individuals were born, lived, and died within the confines of the hollow, never truly escaping its boundaries. Moreover, the timing and frequency of these deaths added to the sense of unease. In a typical community, death would be spread across generations, with each loss marking a distinct chapter in a family's history. In the hollow, however, the deaths often occurred in clusters, with the same names appearing in close succession. This pattern was a testament to the genetic isolation and the lack of diversity, as each generation's passing seemed to be mirrored by the next. The certificates, therefore, became a silent testament to the hollow's unique and troubling legacy. The repetition of names also revealed the hidden cost of isolation. As the family line continued to intertwine, the genetic pool became increasingly limited, leading to a cycle of repeated traits and vulnerabilities. The death certificates, while official documents, inadvertently exposed the consequences of a closed system where the outside world was never truly part of the equation. Each name that appeared on a certificate was a reminder of the hollow's isolation and the enduring impact of its inbred lineage. In the end, these death certificates were more than mere records, they were pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed the hollow's dark and hidden reality. They spoke of a family trapped in a cycle of repetition, a community that had become its own world, isolated from the natural flow of life and death. The repetition of names on these documents was a haunting reflection of a legacy that had been shaped by isolation, control, and the unbroken chain of the patriarch's authority. As the generations passed within the secluded hollow, the family's genetic makeup began to subtly shift, shaped by the lack of external influence and the continual intermingling of closely related individuals. Over time, the patterns of inheritance that might have been mitigated by outside bloodlines became increasingly pronounced. Traits that would have been diluted in a more diverse gene pool began to amplify, creating a lineage that reflected not just a family's history, but the consequences of isolation. The genetic landscape of the Hollow evolved into a closed system, where each new generation inherited a complex tapestry of traits that were both familiar and, at times, troubling. This genetic convergence meant that physical and cognitive traits were repeated with greater frequency. Features that were once distinct became more common, and conditions that might have remained rare or mild in a broader population emerged more prominently. Without the influx of genetic diversity from outside families, the family's gene pool narrowed, leading to an increase in hereditary traits that were reinforced with each successive generation. What might have been anomalies in a larger community became normalized, and the family's identity was increasingly defined by this genetic continuity. In this environment, the family's health and well-being were intimately tied to the patterns of their lineage. Conditions that might have been rare in a more diverse population became more evident and sometimes more severe. The lack of external genetic input created a situation where certain traits, both beneficial and detrimental, were perpetuated without balance. This isolation created a situation where the family's genetic legacy was both a source of continuity and a potential source of vulnerability. The cyclical nature of reproduction within the Hollow meant that the family's genetic traits became more pronounced, and the boundaries of what was considered normal expanded within the confines of the Hollow. The effects of this genetic narrowing were not immediately visible to those outside the Hollow, but they became increasingly apparent with each generation. The family's physical appearance, health, and behavior were shaped by these inherited patterns, and the impact of their isolation was woven into the fabric of their lineage. This evolving genetic landscape highlighted the profound influence of isolation on human biology, illustrating how the absence of diversity could lead to a distinct and, at times, fragile genetic identity. Moreover, the family's genetic evolution was a silent testament to the consequences of their isolation. It underscored the importance of genetic diversity in maintaining health and resilience, and it illustrated how the absence of such diversity could shape the future of a lineage in ways that were both subtle and profound. As the family continued to intermarry and reproduce within the Hollow, their genetic legacy became increasingly defined by the patterns of their own making, creating a legacy that was as much a product of their environment as it was of their ancestry. This genetic continuity, shaped by isolation, revealed the intricate interplay between environment, heredity, and the long-term effects of living in a closed system. As whispers began to transform into rumors, and rumors evolved into undeniable truths, the Hollow's isolation became less of a shield and more of a prison. Over the years, the family's patterns of behavior, once concealed by the mountains, started to seep into the consciousness of those who heard tales from distant relatives or travelers passing through neighboring areas. These whispers spoke of strange occurrences, of repeated names and unusual family dynamics that defied the natural order. What had once been hidden in silence now began to stir curiosity and suspicion. The rumors that emerged were not just idle gossip, they were fragments of a larger, unsettling reality. The isolated nature of the Hollow meant that any word of its peculiarities traveled slowly, but as more people shared what they had heard, the Hollow's secrets gained a form of notoriety. Neighbors and distant acquaintances who had once dismissed the family's uniqueness started to question the nature of their existence. The whispers grew louder, fueled by the human tendency to seek explanations for what cannot be easily understood. As the rumors spread, the family's isolation was gradually pierced by the outside world's curiosity. What had been a quiet, self-contained existence now faced the penetrating gaze of external scrutiny. The patriarch, who had long controlled the narrative within the Hollow, found it increasingly difficult to maintain the same level of secrecy. The whispers, once just murmurs in the wind, now carried a weight that demanded attention and, eventually, investigation. The transformation from whispers to whispers of denial and then to outright disbelief reflected a shift in perception. The Hollow, once a place of obscurity, became a symbol of a dark mystery that others felt compelled to unravel. The family's internal dynamics, once unquestioned, were now seen through the lens of suspicion and moral concern. The community, both nearby and distant, began to piece together the patterns that had remained hidden for so long, connecting the dots of inbreeding, isolation, and the patriarch's unchallenged authority. This growing awareness also meant that the Hollow could no longer sustain its complete isolation. The very fabric of its secrecy was unraveling as more people questioned what they had once taken for granted. The whispers that had started as faint echoes became a chorus of inquiry, urging a deeper exploration of the family's history. The outside world, previously unaware or indifferent, now sought to understand the truth behind the Hollow's peculiar legacy. In this way, the transition from rumors to a broader awareness marked a turning point. The Hollow's secrets, once protected by geography and silence, were now exposed to the light of scrutiny. The family's isolation, which had served as both a shield and a shackle, was no longer impenetrable. The whispers had grown into a call for understanding, and the hollow's hidden reality was poised to be revealed, challenging the very foundations of the patriarch's control and the family's secluded existence. As the years turned into decades, and the hollow's secrets remained tightly woven into the fabric of its isolation, the whispers and rumors that once floated around the edges of the family's existence gradually grew into a collective unease. The patterns of behavior and the repeated names in birth and death records began to draw the attention of historians and researchers who, piecing together the fragments of the past, started to uncover the unsettling truth. Modern investigations, often driven by advances in DNA testing and genealogical research, brought the hidden patterns of the family's history into the light, exposing what had remained concealed for over a century. This revelation was not just a matter of academic curiosity, it was a profound moment of reckoning. For those who had lived within the hollow, the exposure of these patterns shattered the illusion of normalcy that had been maintained through isolation. The family's legacy, once hidden by geography and silence, now stood revealed as a complex and troubling narrative of inbreeding and secrecy. The discovery of these patterns forced a reconsideration of what had been silently endured and normalized within the hollow, and it highlighted the stark consequences of such prolonged isolation. The process of uncovering this history was both painstaking and revelatory. Researchers delved into old records, family trees, and DNA samples, tracing the lineage that had been locked away from the broader world. Each piece of evidence unveiled connections that had been obscured by time and geography, weaving together a story that was both disturbing and illuminating. The patterns that emerged were not merely historical anomalies, they were the echoes of a family's closed-off existence, a testament to the impact of isolation on human biology and social structures. The exposure of these patterns also brought a wave of introspection and, in some cases, regret. For the descendants of the family, understanding the true nature of their heritage was a complex emotional journey. It forced them to confront the realities of their ancestry and the legacy of isolation that had shaped their past. This newfound awareness often led to a re-examination of cultural and familial identity, as well as a broader discussion about the ethical implications of isolation and control within such communities. In the broader context, the discovery of the hollow's hidden history served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme isolation and the human cost of severing ties with the outside world. It underscored the importance of genetic diversity and the risks associated with closed communities, highlighting how the absence of external influence could lead to patterns of inheritance that were both predictable and problematic. The hollow's story, once shrouded in silence, became a powerful narrative that resonated beyond its own boundaries, prompting reflection on the complexities of human nature, community, and the long shadows cast by isolation. In the end, the patterns that had been hidden for so long became a stark reminder of the delicate balance between isolation and connection, and the profound impact that geography and secrecy can have on the human experience.